Why are data centers dying? Well, what a goofy question, because of course there's data centers all over the world, Mr. Farrell, but you found this article that suggests data
Yes.
centers are dying, at least the on-premises ones.
Well, this was our favorite historians, the Gartner analyst group. You know how they document history. The highline says data centers are dying, and then the article says they're almost dead. And when you actually get inside it, what they're actually saying is that data centers aren't very popular. So it's kind of like this, you know, going for the eye-catching headline. I think the thing that I wanted to pull out of this was, it's not so much that data centers are dying. The thing that struck me about this is, yeah, sure, on-premise, you know, the ones that we own, the ones we have in our buildings and all that sort of stuff. I think the real story here is that colocation got better, right?
Yeah, it got better. It certainly got more appealing for a lot of reasons that we can discuss here. But I think, where a good place to start with this is why you don't actually want to do physical data centers. Because as we were working on the notes for this, I started remembering, oh my gosh, all the things that we used to have to do running our own data centers.
All the things I didn't want to, like high quality power supplies, right? You've got to have dual power feeds in from the grid. You've got to have three phases. You've got to be bringing in, kilowatts of power, not just three sockets in the wall. You've got to be up.
And then all the generators out back, or off to the side. I worked at a data center. We had 3 tractor trailer truck size generators on the back. We have huge fuel supplies that we'd have to have come on in, and we got to test them. And is the fuel any good? And and then
Every year somebody had to come in and do take a test of the fuel to see if it was still good. And if it had reached the end of its life, somebody had to bring in a tanker and suck all the fuel out. But then when you emptied the fuel tanks, you had to repump the engines and and there was this, and it was a full-time job just managing, and the electricity. So then if you have a data center, say that was like, I don't know, say 1,000 square meters of data center, which is not particularly big. You had the electricity, you had cooling. So you've got all of the cooling towers blowing air.
And you've got fire suppression you got to deal with, and you got to maintain that whole system and be able to test it sometime with one of your lower end employees. Go stand there and tell us if you can breathe after a while. I think that's how that tested. Anyway, it's what I remember. And then of course you've got the keeping the thing clean. Simple things like sticky mats before you walk into the facility to make sure there's not a lot of dust on your feet. And
even in small ones, I remember when I was first started out, I was the person responsible for cleaning inside there, and I'd be in there with a vacuum cleaner, lifting the tiles and sucking, even the ones that didn't have UPS systems, that didn't have all of the stuff, that was just an oversized broom closet that had a pile of servers and stuff and networking stuff. We would actually have to clean it ourselves.
And of course, you want cable diversity coming into the building. And then you got to talk to your telco. Hey, how is this all getting back to the central office? And they show you maps and they lie. Share with you how the cables were actually routed across town and how they were going to make it diverse for you. And that was a whole project to manage and a thing to deal with and money to spend. And God help you if you weren't in a place that was well connected with a lot of fiber in the area, because they were going to charge you a reassuringly expensive amount of money to get you the fiber you need.
Spent millions running fiber to the data center, like trenching up streets and running fiber in. And then you go to the manhole and you say, and I've actually had telcos deploy redundant feeds to data centers. And then you follow the cable back and it fits into a single manhole. And you go they literally just ran 2 of them into the building, but then terminated as soon as it got out on the street. They went to the same, the same manhole to terminate the fiber. And you go like, that's not redundant.
That's you guys missed what I was going for here. Yeah.
It got redundant from the same manhole. The other one was in the bigger sites, when you got into the really large data center, health and safety. I've seen racks tumble, tip over. And I haven't seen people get hurt, but I've seen racks fall over because somebody was on top of it or pulling on it, and it actually just fell like a rack full of servers. Like you're talking 2 or 3 tons, or even simpler stuff. People tripping over cables left on floors. Not that I'd ever leave a cable in a floor.
Of course you wouldn't. And then there's this whole security aspect. You got to have physical security. You got to have man traps. You got to have 2-factor authentication, some kind of a bioreader, and then who's maintaining that system? I got to go to facilities because we have a new employee on board, or we have a new contractor, and they have to have access. Let's get their fingerprints on record. Let's get their whatever the scan is that you got to do. You got to deal with that. That's a time and a lead, and then so you have people involved to just keep this facility up and running and keep all of the accounts up to date.
Yes.
All of that takes time and people. It's overhead to run a facility like this.
And the final thing was renting space. Like if you're renting an office space and you build part of it into a data center, and let's say you move out of that office space, moving the data center becomes extremely painful because You've actually got to pick up the entire power supplies, UPSs, and move them to the new facility. People are moving office space much more often than they used to. Once upon a time, it was you moved offices every 10 years or every 20 years. But increasingly these days, people move offices every 3 to 5 years. They grow, they shrink, they keep moving for a better location, or they move towns. And so having your data center attached to your office didn't make sense.
All
Doesn't
of
make
this
sense.
to make the point that colo becomes more interesting. And so I think there's one point we should make, Greg, which is by colo, we're not talking about public cloud. We're not talking about moving your stuff into AWS. We're talking about a facility that hosts your gear for you. You still manage it and all of that.
Yeah.
Colo's really interesting. And I think there's a lot of things that are driving these changes, Greg.
Yeah, I thought a few things there. One was hyperconvergence. When we saw VMware, hypervisor virtualization, that was phase one. And then hyperconvergence, this idea that you can have 50 VMs on a single server, that changed a lot of our data centers. Instead of having like racks after racks of machines that did lots of little things, we packed them all into one. So we didn't need as much space was one thing.
Well, it's not just that. I mean, it's also, as you say, hyperconvergence. We're dealing with the storage all coming in one physical unit, not one rack you have space, but one physical unit. Now, you're not managing a bunch of different things. You're managing one block of compute power with everything you need in it that you can slam into the rack and then expand it as you go in a really dense form factor.
That was hyperconvergent. Storage arrays got smaller or even irrelevant. Backups have changed. We're seeing backups go to the cloud instead of having another rack full of tape drives or something like that. So there's all these things. And I think also networking changed as well. There was high-speed networking in the data center. So instead of having a 3-tiered data center, like core distribute edge in the data center and racks of switches and all that sort of stuff, we're now seeing cloth fabrics. And you need like 4 or 5 switches to cover an entire data center.
And then if you look at what you might need for a colo, I mean, if you're a smaller company, you can use a half a rack. 2 switches is really all you need. I mean, you can take that way down and how much forwarding capacity do you need? If you can't do it with 2 switches that are a non-blocking fabric, these ASICs today are incredible in how much they can forward. That's really all you need.
I think we kind of got data centers on premise as a legacy of the old server hugger days, where you had to be close to the server to go and press the button because they used to crash a lot. And in those days, the only way you could reboot them was literally to go out there and power cycle them or press the reset button.
And I think if we start talking about why you wouldn't want to do colo, a lot of the old thinking like that comes to mind. Like, oh, I don't want to do colo because then I don't have access to my stuff that's right there. And do you actually need to go in and press the server button because things went bad on you and that's the only way to get the system back? That's an app problem, not an ops problem anymore. I mean, you've got a bad app.
There was 2 things there. One is VMware allowed you to reboot the VM. When everything got into into hypervisors, that solved a lot of that. And the other one was the advent of power rails and reliable power rails that actually were stable quality. And you could telnet to it and say, reboot the 4th one from the top and, pop the power supplies into the server. So you could actually hard boot it if you had to.
The different colo facilities that I've worked with, they've been hundreds or thousands of miles away. Yeah, I'd go there once or twice a year tops, and it was not tied to, oh gosh, something's broken, I had to go into the colo. No, it was tied to, we're into having a new project and we're building out something and we need to install new physical gear into the space. That was the only reason I'd go into the colo. I think another big objection people would have rather than the physical stuff is just latency. Oh, I don't want it to be that far away from me. That'll introduce all these milliseconds of latency. How much stuff are we operating in public cloud, though, now? I mean, latency's kind of gone out the window, I think.
I think so. And I think also if your head office is in a capital city and your colo is in the same capital city, latency isn't an issue. It's just across town. And you can buy a 1 gig or a 10 gig pipe. That's an issue. Yep. And there's also a business issue here. It's no longer fashionable in modern accounting to own a data center building. There was a time 20 or 30 years ago when buying real estate and holding an asset on the balance sheet was a desirable thing. It bumped up the company's valuation. And because the company used the building, it would then be able to blah, 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 and the data center became an asset. It wasn't regarded as a loss. It was regarded as an investment. Well, accounting has changed. It now sees companies that run data centers or own assets that aren't directly related to the core business. They're an overhead. So there's a transition that happened from then to now in business, in accounting, and the business fashion around that. That's also a major trend. So colos have been around for 20 or 30 years, as long as data centers have been around. But I think the other aspect of this is we need to understand that colocation got much better at this. Over the last 10 years, we've gone from colocation as here's a piece of space, whatever, you know, and it was quite often a big data center that a company didn't want anymore, and they just sort of said, "Here's your rack." But right next to it, you know, in the early days, your rack was right next to someone else's rack, and you could open the door and have a poke around in there.
Yeah,
You know,
but now you can't compete if that's your status. Now you've got tiers you need to adhere to, the security standards that you've got to have just to be competitive with the colo that's across town from you. So
yeah.
right, you walk into just about any colo facility now of any substance, it's been certified. There are security standards that are in place. You're not going to be able to get into the rack next to you.
Handprints, you have to submit your license to prove that you are who you are. The company
You're
has to
being
flag.
monitored on camera.
There's actually artificial intelligence on those cameras so that if you walk anywhere outside the path that's not to your rack, the security will be alerted and they'll come and get you.
Ooh, that's a new one. I wasn't aware that was around. That's cool.
Yeah, really modern ones, the really fancy ones, they just track where you're
Yep.
walking. And if you're walking around the building aimlessly, security will come and say,
Mostly
why?
checking to see if anyone's got an unlocked cabinet.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
You laugh, but I've
No,
actually,
I get it. I get it. I see that. That's really interesting. Yeah.
when Colos stepped up that physical security and they
Mhm.
stepped up their power. So the flip side of this is that they were able to bring in 50 megawatts or 100 megawatts, like, you know, tens of megawatts into a colo.
Yeah.
And there was always power for the next thing that you wanted to do. There was constraints, of course, around cooling and weight and floor space, but generally they would do it better. Whereas if you're in your data center and you're pulling down say 500 kilowatts and you need to exceed that, you had to go redo the power system. So again, that scalability of a colo was a feature. That was something they put on the security. But I think the biggest thing for me in colos now is telco bandwidth. They got the telcos to come and set up POPs in those colos. And so now when I want to get more bandwidth, I could just turn it on.
Yeah, especially at the huge sites like SuperNAP and Equinix and so on. They've got data centers around the world. The expectation is there's massive amounts of fiber and bandwidth that are coming in because some of the business for colocation is being driven by public cloud, where you want to have quick access to AWS and Azure and so on. And so you've got those big public cloud companies that are plumbing into the SuperNAPs and the Equinixes and lots of other places. There are lots of internet exchanges where that is happening too, to bring those closer to you. And you've ended up with a colocation facility that is so well connected. Having your equipment on your own data center that isn't going to be nearly well connected, it almost feels stupid, dumb, like you're giving up on an advantage you'd have otherwise.
Well, as long as you like to torment yourself by dealing with telcos, maybe that's a good idea. So I think the other thing that's happening here is we're actually even seeing the companies who do the interconnection develop their own software platforms just to speed that up. So it's actually all done, all they do is run a cable into your rack and they can turn on and off the extra bandwidth that you need, virtually. Now, even if your telco isn't competent at doing that software development themselves, there's companies out there building software-defined interconnect products. Colo facility can actually go and take a product off the shelf and do software-defined, you want a 2 gig VP, virtual circuit coming down that 10 gig Ethernet we give you, click. There you go. Here's your
I
IP.
talked to a company that was their whole thing, but I did a briefings and brief episode on it a while back. That was exactly that. It was really, really cool what they did.
Yeah. They basically wrote it for somebody and now they turned it into a product. So I think that's Colo doing it better. They've got more access to power. They can do all the cooling in the world and they've got so much capacity that you can scale up. Why would you want to have a headcount allocated to data center health and safety and all that sort of stuff? So my point would be is that data centers on-premise are dying for lots of those reasons because all the things we talked about. But let's not forget that colocation got better. They got better at giving me services I want, giving me bandwidth, giving me enough power, writing the right sort of contract so I can have this much space now, but there's this much space later, putting in shelving so that isolate my space and keep it safe, all that sort of stuff.
But to go back to the Gartner, premise, they were talking about how data centers are fading, or on-premises data centers that you own are fading, and they did have some points there. So colocation, a big one that we've been talking about. Another point is public cloud. People are moving to public cloud. Hopefully, a lot of the folks are doing it right. They're in their second iteration where they're going, oh, so picking it up and moving it was like really super expensive. So it turns out we should re-architect our application so we can get the cost benefit out of public cloud. So folks are beginning to do that now. We are seeing more and more of that. But then also SaaS. I mean, how many folks are retiring their in-house legacy Exchange email because they're now doing Office 365 mail? That's one example of many SaaS.
Like your in-house accounting is going to Oracle SaaS, or you're moving to SAP HANA,
Phone
which is
call centers.
your phone system is moving, into cloud-hosted PBXs. Do you want to run those on-prem or off? They would all be lumped into the same. And there's a certain point at which the scale of the on-prem just becomes pointless, right? You had all of those things there. It made sense to have a data center. Maybe, the numbers were different. I do remember walking into a data center many years ago, and this company had just been acquired, and I was brought in to do an evaluation of all the servers and everything that was in there. And this thing was full, and over here was a data general and a mainframe, and there was minis, and there was all this stuff. And then after the acquisition, and we'd done an evaluation, we worked out that 80% of that stuff wasn't necessary, and 10% of the stuff could be downsized because it wasn't being, and we ended up with 4 racks in the corner of this 30-meter by 30-meter data center.
All of a sudden, we have too much cooling capacity. When did that happen? Yeah.
Yeah, we couldn't even turn the cooling down far enough.
Yeah.
We couldn't back it off. It was freezing in there. We couldn't back the cooling down.
Not enough heat going in to bounce it out. Okay, but I do think there are cases where on-premises data centers still make sense. So one might be you kind of have your space for free because you've had it for a long time. It's at sunk cost, it's amortized, it's just there, you're running stuff, and it kind of feels like it's free. I mean, it isn't, practically speaking, right? There's always a cost, but too hard to change. Why not? Maybe you've got some really odd security requirements and you don't feel comfortable.
Physical security, usually physical. You have to make sure that the physical assets can't be tampered with, which can be very difficult in a colo.
Yeah, I've been in some data centers where there was, the magic Colos box was locked up and only one person knew the special combo and had the key to get into there because you had to have the Colos encryption box, off on its own.
HSM, hardware modules and all that's, how they're doing those. You can do software versions of those now. On-prem used to be easier to do repairs, although somehow I also think colo can be easier for repairs too. So in the old days, getting spare parts shipped to your office but if you're a company of a certain size, you have to come in through the post system or the dispatch office. Mm-hmm. Then you have to get them and sign for them, and then you're not allowed to wheel them around the building. You have to get somebody.
I was thinking about this though, the whole repair thing, whether it's a physical one like that, where you need, some failed hardware component shipped and then installed, or I can kind of talk myself out of it where for the most part, although it would be nice. Oh, they ship it to me, it comes to my desk, and then I unbox it, and then I can walk in and, slam the new power supply or whatever it is. You can deal with...
I love you, brother. I love you.
That's a thing, man. Come on, that's a thing. Because we all feel that way. If you rack that thing, and you remember putting those screws in and putting the sticky label on with the management IP or whatever your naming convention was, you do have an emotional attachment to that stuff. So there is a sense. It's stupid, but there is a little sense of letting go.
It is, I agree.
Generally speaking, though, really, any of those circumstances, someone at the colo is going to be able to take care of that for you. And if it's not that sort of a failure, again, goes back to a point I made earlier. If you've got a failure that requires you to walk in and touch something to get an application back, you don't have an operations problem. You've got an application problem where you need to change your design. So it's hard for me to make that case that, I just feel so comfortable when there's my data center just a few cubicles away. I can walk in there and do my thing.
I think the other one that strikes me is data gravity. If you've got petabytes or, hundreds of gigabytes of data on site, it can be a problem to get it off site. Like if you've got a data lake that you've built and you're constantly updating it and hammering it, you can't find a couple of days to make a copy of that and move it to another, like if you're that sort of business. And so data gravity is wherever the data is, that's where your CPUs are. It doesn't matter how much you'd like to put your CPUs in the cloud or VMs in the cloud or whatever, in a colo. At the end of the day, if you've got some sort of storage array that's got 500 terabytes of data, that's going to take you a day to 7 days to replicate across the cloud.
And it's a huge commitment to move it. And Amazon has services to effectively roll a truck to get your data for you. I mean, I don't think it's literally rolling a truck.
That gets you in the cloud. It doesn't get you in a colo. Yeah.
You got to pick it up and move it to get it there because copying across the internet is just impractical. Yeah, I agree. Data gravity is a real problem. Another one is just maybe the only thing you've got left is your legacy apps that have a lifespan, and that lifespan in 2 more years it's gone because we're actively migrating to
we've canceled the contract. There's 2 years left to run. We've got to be out in 2 years. Yeah. There's no point in shutting down, doing anything with it, moving it. We'll just wait for it to terminate and run it out. But I think all of those issues are good ones as to why you'd stay on premise. There's one more, which is if you've got non-critical stuff, like developers or testing or validation, you can get a lot of stuff in a broom closet, like one rack of hyper-converged gear can give you 1,000, 2,000 VMs in just,
Dude, a half rack.
you know,
I mean, it's astonishing how much you can cram in there. It
you
really.
can get 200 terabytes in a half rack, you know, with 1,000 VMs, no problem at all. So but is that a data center or is that something else, right? So there's more than one type. But to me, I think, you know, the winning statement here is that Colos got good. They had plenty of power available. They had plenty of bandwidth available. They got the security issues solved. They got the pricing to the point of where you wanted it. They were located in places where you wanted it to be, you know, in a capital city. So if you're, you know, like when I was in London, I'd be at offices in London. It was easy to get to them to do the work. If I had to, I've had entire contracts where I was working for companies I never even seen the data center.
And Greg, you're
Like,
saying capital city. I live in a rural part of America, and I can name data centers that are in places you wouldn't think. And you walk in the door in this reasonably small town, and my word, there's a well-connected little data center sitting there that you can do colo. That's their primary
Yes.
business. So it's astonishing where they're popping up.
Yeah, I know. I used to work on a data center that was in places like Jamaica and Gibraltar, and I never went to them and never wanted to. Everybody else could go. I wasn't going to go and travel. Yeah, I know what it looked like. And they'd come back, you know, they'd always come back like eyes hanging out. And they go like, oh, I was in the data center 18 hours a day. I said, did you see anything? They went, no. And I was like, yeah, that's not my idea of a good day. I would think that Colos got better. That's my key takeaway here. It's not that data centers suck, powerful reasons as to why you will want to be there. And it's also partly linked to business fashion. They don't want to own stuff anymore because business doesn't know where it's going. It doesn't know what the future holds. So it's going to opt for the rental. I can turn all this down and not have to worry about selling off a real estate asset or whatever. And so it's much more confusing. And SaaS, as you said, companies are outsourcing a lot of these apps. They're moving them so they don't have to run them or own them or manage them. And so it's not so much the data center's dying. I think it's that everything else got better and let the data center, you know, lose its relevance going forward.
So what about you? Are you in the public cloud? Are you using a colo facility? Are you on premises? What is your data center world looking like these days? Leave us some comments. We'd appreciate that and get a sense of what's going on out there.